let's take a look at how we can package and reuse functionality using Tailwind CSS plugins and presets. We're going to use the shadcn UI components as an example. shadcn UI is a set of reusable UI components built with Radix UI and Tailwind CSS. And it's pretty important to note, as the author mentions, that this is not a component library, but rather a set of components that you can copy and paste in your project as a starting point. And that's precisely in that context that we're going to take some of this copy and paste stuff and make it a bit more reusable for our project. I had grand plans to start playing with all the UI components, but as I scrolled through the installation steps, I got nerd sniped right here. I saw this Tailwind config file and I saw all these CSS variables being consumed for things like colors. And scrolling a bit further down, I saw the CSS file where these CSS variables are being defined for the root scope and the dark class. In the theming tab, you can see that these CSS variables are being used to define background and foreground colors for different elements like cards, popovers, border colors, inputs, etc. This approach is really familiar to me. As you may know, I've built an entire Pro Tailwind workshop on how to build multi-theme strategies with Tailwind CSS. In my workshop, we take all this functionality from the CSS file and the Tailwind config and package it together in a Tailwind CSS plugin. So of course, immediately when I saw this setup in shadcn UI, I thought it would be pretty cool to recreate this plugin that packages the functionality for the specific use case of shadcn UI. I want to be really clear, I'm not saying that shadcn should have created a plugin here. Let's remember that this intentionally is not a component library. Rather, it's a bunch of useful code that you can copy and make yours. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to spin off a new shadcn UI project and then make it ours by creating some abstractions that let us reuse the same theming functionality across multiple projects using these components. Alright, so we're gonna start with a brand new project using the Create Next app with this template starter. I'll copy the command for npm and I'll paste it here, and let's call our project shadcn-theming. And this is going to create a new Next.js 13 app, but with all the shadcn UI setup already baked in. There we go, let's cd into our shadcn theming project and open it in VS Code. Alright, and before we look at the code, let's run the project with npm run dev and have a look. And here's our starting point. So this is a Next.js app with a homepage that has a bit of UI, and you can see dark and light mode is being supported as well. And slide aside, in the YouTube comments of my last video, I had lots of comments about using dark mode. So there you have it. I'm using dark mode in this one. If I look in the app directory, we're going to have this page, which is what we've just looked at. Nothing special about it. This is just some utility classes. You can see that here it's using button variants, which under the hood is using CVA or class variant authority. And here we import these variant styles from the button component. So that file is in components and then UI and then button. You can see CVA is being imported here. And then all these variants are being defined. And I'll probably make a video on CVA separately. For now, just so we have a little bit more visual feedback on our theming implementation, I'll also import the actual button component from that same file. And we're going to add a couple of buttons after our two links. And we'll choose a variant. Here are the variants that we can use. And let's go with secondary. And let's duplicate this and have another one that is using the ghost variant, just so we have a little bit more variation to look at. And we'll also change the default colors to make them a little bit more recognizable. So let's take a look at our Tailwind config file. There's a bunch of customizations like this container here, but what we're interested in for this video is this extended colors object, where you can see these CSS variables defined with semantic meanings for all sorts of UI elements. We also have customizations for border radius, font family, keyframe animations, and finally we register a plugin called Tailwind CSS Animate, which brings a lot of pretty cool enter and leave animations and expands on what Tailwind CSS provides in terms of animation out of the box. Before they can be consumed, all these CSS variables like --border, --inputs, etc. have to be defined somewhere. And this somewhere, as we've seen, is in the CSS file global.css. We have our 3 Tailwind layer directives, and then we expand the base layer with a root scope set of CSS variable for each of these colors that you've seen, and the same with dark. Now note this specific syntax. This is not a color definition, but rather a set of individual channel values. Back in the Tailwind config file, you can see that we create HSL colors and then consume these CSS variables to together compose the correct HSL color syntax. And as mentioned in the shadcn UI docs, this is how you set it up according to the Tailwind CSS documentation. HSL might be less familiar to you than something like RGB, but the really cool thing about HSL is it's much easier for the human brain to kind of figure out what sort of color you'd get based on what value. Let me show you what I mean, and we're going to update the primary color and the secondary color in our CSS file. So the root scope variables are for the light mode, and if I find the primary definition, background is 222, the foreground is 210 with 98% luminance. These are the values we get. The first number for H or hue is the color hue, a value between 0 and 360. The second one is the saturation percentage. 0% will be completely grayscale and 100% ultra vibrant. And then the luminance is the amount of light of white in the color. With the low value, you'll have a dark color, and with the high value, you'll have a very bright color. So if you try, keep in mind the background and foreground colors here for the light mode, and then I scroll to the dark mode, definitions right here, you'll see that these are the exact same values, but inverted between foreground and background. Since we're defaulting to dark mode in our UI, let's change the dark class scope primary color. So the first thing I'll do is change the luminance to 50%. And this should move away from being almost white and have a lot more contrast to it. So there you go. With 50% luminance, we get this blue at the 210 hue value. Let's try change the hue to 100. Now we get green. What do we get with 300? All right, I like that one. And just to show you the saturation, if we had 4% only, it would likely be very gray. Yep. And if we had 94, it would be ultra saturated bright, probably too much. So let's go with 75% here. And yeah, still bright, but I think for a recorded screencast, this is pretty good. And I will use the same hue for the foreground, so 300. And let's see if we can get away with light text here. So I'll go 98% luminance. So it's going to be almost completely white. And that might not pass the accessibility test, but for this example, I think that works. Maybe let's bump down the luminance to 40% on the primary color, just to add a little bit more contrast. Okay. And just for simplicity of numbers, I'll round this to 50%. And now I will copy these values and go up in the light mode right here. And I will paste these, but invert the values. So I'll paste that here, cut that, and put it up there. So now this is what the button looks like in dark mode. And in light mode, actually that doesn't really work. Let's add a little bit more saturation and maybe a little bit less luminance for the light mode. So I'll go to 80% here and 75% for the background, which means we need to make our foreground much darker. Let's go 10% or even 5%. And you know what? I'm fluffing around here, but let's go back up to 90%. So it's slightly less dark for the background. And bring that back to 20% maybe. And yeah, that works. So you can see what I mean by playing with HSL values in a way that makes more sense than trying to guess colors from RGB channels from 0 to 255. It's also possible, but it's much harder to visually represent how to dial in the amount of whiteness and the amount of intensity of the color and then the color hue. And that's why people enjoy using HSL for color values. All right, let's do the same for the secondary colors. I'll go a little bit faster. Here, I'll go 100 for both the foreground and background. Again, we'll go with 40% luminance and 75% saturation. And I don't quite like this green, so let's try 180. I have no idea what colors. Oh, yeah, I like this one. We'll make it slightly darker for a little bit more contrast, and that's great. I will copy these values and go up in the root scope, which is the light mode, and paste these. But flip them around. So let's have the same saturation and luminance values we had for the primary color. I'm not saying these are good choices and good design, but this gives us something to work with to make sure that our theming implementation works. And there's one more thing I want to add before we create our plugin. Remember that in our config file, we import this Tailwind CSS Animate plugin. I'm going to add a couple of the classes that it provides to this secondary button, just to make sure we don't break the support for this plugin in our implementation. So here I will add a class name attribute, and I will go with Animate. And you can see the additional classes provided by the plugin. I'll go Animate in, Zoom in, and let's set a duration of 500. This is provided by Tailwind Core, just so it's nice and slow. So now when I refresh the page, you can see this button zoom in over half a second. Again, not the greatest design choice, but this is just a way to make sure visually that we're not breaking things. All right, With all that in place, let's start consolidating things within the plugin. The reason you'd want a plugin in the first place is, imagine you've customized a lot of these CSS variables and you want to reuse the same value across projects. Of course, you can copy and paste this CSS file, but it would be really nice to have something that you can bring along to any Tailwind project through the config file, and also abstract away all of this in the config and make all of that, the theme extension and the CSS variable definition, bundle together because they share the same concern, and then be able to reuse that on any project. That's what we're going to do. All right, this is not a necessity, but I want to convert the Tailwind config file to a TS file and switch from CommonJS requires to use ESM import. I will import the type called config from Tailwind CSS. I'll remove that, and instead of module export const config equals, and down there export default config. And you can see it suggests as config. You might be able to do it like this, I'm not quite sure. But in the Tailwind docs, they show the satisfies config syntax, so we'll go with that. There's one more thing to change at the top. Instead of using require here, we're going to import font family from Tailwind CSS / default theme. And I lied, there is one more. You can see here we're requiring the Tailwind CSS animate plugin. I will also import it here. Import, let's call it animate plugin from Tailwind CSS / animate. So down here, instead of requiring this plugin, we can just register it as we've imported it. Animate plugin. So now our config is using TypeScript and it knows to satisfy the correct type. And interestingly enough, you can see that we actually have a little error in this here. The height is having a number, but it's actually expecting a string. I don't think that ends up mattering in that instance, but let's change the 2 zeros here to be a string of 0. And you can see that now everything is satisfied and we don't have any red squigglies anymore. All right, so what we're going to do is create another plugin that we're going to register here and then start moving things over to the plugin. You can do that wherever you want, but I will go in the lib directory here and we're going to create a new plugin file. Because this is the shadcn default, I'll call it shadcn-plugin.ts. All right, and here I will import the plugin function from Tailwind CSS / plugin, and I will export a const called shadcn plugin, which is going to call that plugin function we've imported. And inside that function, we have another function, which is where we're going to grab a lot of utilities provided by the plugin API. In our case, looking at the CSS file, we want to add stuff to the base layer. And therefore, we're going to import the add base countdown copilot utility. I think that's all we need. And so there's two main moving parts to our setup. There is the CSS file with the CSS variable definition, and then the Tailwind config where we extend the theme. And we want to do both these things inside our plugin. So I'll put some comments. 1, add CSS variable definitions to the base layer, which we're going to do here. And 2, extend the Tailwind theme with themable utilities. Looks like we're all set up to get started. Let's do a quick hello world to make sure that our plugin is going to work. So here I will add base, and in a CSS in JavaScript object, I will target the body tag and change everything with text transform uppercase. That's not going to work just yet since we haven't registered the plugin, but the idea is that all of this text, the button text, everything is going to go uppercase once I register it in the Tailwind config. So at the top of the Tailwind config, I will import our named export called shadcn plugin. Yep, from lib shadcn plugin. And I'll go right at the bottom of the config file. And after our animate plugin, I will register the shadcn plugin. And we're hoping that our UI is now all uppercase and yelling at us, and it sure is. All right, let's get rid of that. And we are now confident that our stars are going to get injected from the plugin, which is perfect. So we can do the thing we want to do. So I'm going to delete that. And instead, what we want to port over here are these styles we have in the base layer. So there's 2 at layer base declarations. There's our CSS variables for colors here, and then another one. So let's start with the first one. I want to port over everything from the root scope selector to the end of the dark class modifier. we need to use a CSS in JavaScript syntax instead of just CSS. And instead of manually doing the transformation, I'll use a pretty cool online tool. I will go to transform.tools and I'm going to search for CSS to JavaScript objects. So you can see you paste some regular CSS and it gives you the CSS in JS equivalent. And I will paste this inside the tool. And here's our conversion. I don't want the converted variable, but I'll grab everything below that up to this closing brace. And inside of here, I will paste the entire CSS in JavaScript object. And by just doing that, we should be able to delete all the CSS that we've ported from the CSS file, and everything should still work exactly the same. Because we're now injecting the same CSS in our base layer, but through the plugin API. So let's try that. We're going to remove the entire @layer base declaration that contains all the CSS variables here. So I'll select all of that and delete it. And if I refresh my UI, you can see that everything still works using the CSS variable declarations from the plugin. And just to prove that, I'm going to remove the plugin import right here in the config file. And you can see that now we have lost all the colors and border radius themable utility classes. And so everything is not themed at all. And if we bring it back, once again, everything is back here and it works on both dark and light. All right, now let's take care of the second @layer base block. You can see a particularity of this one is it uses the apply directive. All it's trying to do is for every element apply the default border color that we've defined in this border CSS variable. And then on the body tag, do the same for the background color of things and the foreground color of things, as well as adding some font feature settings. So I will copy that and let's delete it. So we now have a bare bones CSS file with just the 3 Tailwind directives. And this time we're going to do it manually. I'll collapse this @base function call and I can call it a second time. I'm going to paste that invalid CSS syntax and convert it to a CSS in JavaScript object. So we'll put the star selector in quotes. Let's add a comma here, set the body in quotes as well. And let's do everything that is technically not @apply. And you might wonder, how do I use @apply? There's no real official way of doing it, but you can sneakily create a key value pair, turn the whole @apply declaration as a key and have an empty object as the value. And in most cases, and definitely for this simple implementation, this is going to work. So I'll do the same here, add the comma, and now we have a valid CSS in JavaScript object. So let's go and verify in the UI that actually we can find on the body tag the background and foreground colors set on things. I'll go in the UI and yep, you can see here we have a background color and text color set to the CSS variable as well as the font features settings. And if I scroll down looking for the star selector, yep, we can also find the border color set, so it is working. Our step 1 here is completely done now. And essentially, if all you wanted to do is not to have to copy and paste CSS variable definitions in all of your projects, at this point, you would already technically be done. But we're going to take it to the next level by taking care of the other part of the plugin implementation, which is extending the Tailwind theme with new utility classes. And what I mean by that is do everything we currently do in our Tailwind config file in the theme object. And that actually also includes setting up this container. But where we extend the colors, I want to port all of this to the plugin so it is collocated with the actual CSS variable declaration, which makes a ton of sense because both these things actually work closely together. So check this out. I'm going to leave on the edge and I'm going to copy the entire theme object in the config file up to where it closes here before the plugins, and I will cut this. So it's in my clipboard, but it's out of the config file. And yep, we've borked everything. Tailwind is looking for a border class that we've injected in the base layer, but we're not extending our theme anymore, so we're not creating this border utility, and we crashed everything. But now, take a look at this. In our Tailwind CSS plugin, if I hover over the plugin function, you can see it can take 2 parameters. The first one is this handler function, the plugin creator, which is this function here where we have access to all sorts of useful helper functions from the plugin API. But the second argument is a config object, which is literally another config file, which is going to be merged with the main Tailwind config file. The first argument of our plugin function is this entire function here. And then the second argument, if we add a comma, if I open an object, you will see that I have access to all these properties from a Tailwind config. The content array, dark mode, experimental flag, future, and of course, the theme. And so by selecting theme here, I can extend or override the Tailwind theme just like we currently do in the config file, but I can do it from the plugin, and this is going to be merged with the config file. So you might see where I'm going with this. In my clipboard, I have the entire theme object that we cut off the Tailwind config file, and I will paste that here. So now I'm doing exactly what I was doing before, but I'm doing it from the plugin. You might have noticed when I scroll, there is a red squiggly for the font family here. We are not importing that in our plugin. Right now in our Tailwind config, we were importing this font family from the default theme, so I will cut that out of there, and instead I will import it in my plugin. Nothing should be red squiggled anymore. We're good. If I go and check out the browser, we've now recreated the custom themable utility classes from the plugin, injected in the theme, and consuming the CSS variable, and everything works just like it did before. This is what our CSS file looks like. This is what our Tailwind config file looks like, and the majority of the complexity of this implementation has been abstracted to a plugin in one file with everything that it needs to do and that we can reuse across projects. That's pretty cool. Let's take it a little bit further. Just like we have a completely vanilla CSS file here, let's see if we can make our Tailwind config even closer to a default vanilla new Tailwind project config file. For example, I see this dark mode class declaration. And what if we moved that out of the Tailwind config file and instead moved it to our plugin? So remember, we have access to the whole config here in the second plugin function parameter. So if I was to type the letter D, you can see we have dark mode. And so let's paste our dark mode class definition here as well. And dark mode should still work just fine. But we're getting one step closer to a truly vanilla Tailwind config, which essentially just has the content array because this is required, and our shadcn plugin. So actually, I want to also move the animate plugin out of here, and I will cut the import into my clipboard. And now I'm pretty happy with how minimal and vanilla this Tailwind config file feels. We just have the content array, but like I mentioned, this is required. And then we register one plugin, and that's it. Because I've removed the animate plugin, let's refresh the page and verify that this secondary button is in fact not animating. You can see the local host here jumping when I refresh. I'm hard refreshing and again, and nothing is happening. All right, that's what we were expecting. And now in our shadcn plugin, I'm going to import that. And where we set the dark mode and theme, let's collapse our theme. And after the theme, I will look for the plugins array and register my animate plugin like that. And now if I go and refresh the page, I am hoping Mr. Secondary here is going to zoom in. But as I hard refresh, you can see that it's not working and we don't have any of the zoom effect. And honestly, I'm not 100% sure why it's not working, but I have a theory, because here we're doing something kind of weird if you think about it. We're registering the shadcn plugin in the Tailwind config file, and then this plugin registers its own plugin in the nested plugin array. So while themes get merged together, perhaps plugins don't work that way. I'll show you a solution to this, but let's quickly render a pre-tag in the UI with the plugins array to understand what's happening. In this page here, we're going to have a pre-tag under the buttons. So I will import resolve config from Tailwind CSS/resolve config. And I will import the config file itself. Import Tailwind config from @/Tailwind config. And with these two imports, I can get the resolved config by calling resolve config and passing the Tailwind config. And I'll go after the buttons here and go pre with the empty 8 class to give a bit of space. And we are going to json.stringify. Yes, exactly that. But instead of logging the theme, because it has a lot of values, I will output the plugins array. And whoops, apologies, I want this after the closing div. And you can see we have this array of plugins. The first plugin is the shadcn plugin where we add all our themable color variables. But you can see that for the second one, we have a nested plugins array inside the plugins array. And this might be our problem. And here again, I know that the themes get deep merged intelligently, but maybe the same does not happen with plugins. That's an assumption, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to show you a way to work around this, and it's using Tailwind presets. So the Tailwind config file has a presets array. And sort of like plugins, the presets array lets you package up and reuse functionality that you bring in your config. But instead of just bringing a plugin, it lets you bring an entire config to merge with the existing config. So what I want to do here, even if it does not exist yet, is have a shadcn preset where we can organize another Tailwind config file that we want to bring in as a preset, but have a little bit more flexibility on how we structure things and import our plugins. So let's delete that for now. And in my lib folder next to the shadcn plugin, I will create a shadcn preset.ts. And this is essentially another Tailwind config file that we're going to import in the presets array. So let me import the type config from Tailwind CSS, and I will export a const shadcn preset and make it satisfy the config type. Right out of the gates, we have a TypeScript problem because a Tailwind config file must have a content array. Now, the content array does not get merged with the actual Tailwind config file that you're using, so we're going to just have an empty array here and let the Tailwind config file define the content array. Content empty array. And technically, this is now a valid config file and therefore a valid preset. I can go in the actual Tailwind config file. I will import shadcn preset that we've just created and register it like so. So what we want to do is get rid of our plugins array here and remove the import. And all we want to define here is the content array and our presets array. I've removed the theming plugin, so once again, our UI is completely broken. But now let's go in our preset, and here I will import the shadcn plugin. I need to update the path since we're in the same directory now. And here I will register a plugins array with the shadcn plugin. Our UI, our theming strategy, and dark mode is working again. But remember, if I refresh, there is no animation, and we still have this problem where we have the nested plugin inside the other plugins array. But now that we're defining this preset, we don't have to do everything through the plugins array anymore. So I can go in the plugin and actually port over a few things here. I will stop registering the animate plugin here and also not do the dark mode class strategy here because that feels more of a concern for our preset if you think about it. So I'll delete that and cut the import. In my preset here, I will import the animate plugin, register it, and I will add the dark mode strategy set to class. And now, because the plugins are defined at the same level and not nested inside another, I feel like when I refresh the page, yes, we have our zoom in animation. So the animate plugin is working once again. And you can see the plugins array being output. We have our first plugin, which is the Tailwind CSS animate plugin. And then at the same level, the second plugin, which is our shadcn plugin with all the CSS variables. And everything is tightly defined in this preset here. And you can imagine if more complexity was to come, this is a nice and scalable way to handle everything you want to pass as a preset to a default Tailwind config. And all we have to do in our Tailwind config is import the preset and register it in the presets array. For even more scale, you can have multiple presets. So there's definitely room for growth here. But let me show you if I comment out the preset here, none of the theming functionality or the zoom animation is working. And you can see we have an empty plugins array. If in the preset, I decide to just bring the animate plugin, and let's bring back the presets array in the Tailwind config, we have no theming, but the zoom is working because this plugin has been registered. And then if I bring back shadcn plugin as well, we have our entire functionality back in action. And there you have it. Now you have this really nice Tailwind preset that packages all of shadcn UI's theming and animation functionality in one place. You can bring it along to any project and start consuming shadcn UI components with the same theme colors without having to copy and paste stuff across projects. Of course, there's way more that you could do now that your CSS variables are defined from the plugin in JavaScript. If you don't want to define your colors in this weird HSL channel syntax, you could write a bit of JavaScript that takes, let's say, a hex color and then converts it to this HSL syntax. That would also let you import the colors from Tailwind CSS/colors if you want to use these to pass to your theming strategy. I'm thinking support for multiple color themes that support both light and dark modes, set up theme scopes in CSS, a theme switcher in the UI to toggle between the theme, and all of this would be generated programmatically with JavaScript in the plugin. That's exactly the sort of stuff we get into in my Pro Tailwind multi-theme strategy workshop, so if you're interested, definitely check it out. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.